The headlines. A mysterious feline has been spotted roaming through the gardens of East Finchley. Fun fact, where I used to go to church. Initial descriptions of this creature were laughed off by authorities on the grounds that it was probably just Alan Tishmarsh wearing leopard print. However, as more and more sightings were reported, so more and more guesses were made about what the creature was. I think it was a jaguar, said one mum, because it had great acceleration. Her 7-year-old daughter commented, well, it turned up in the garden around tea time, and from what I've read, that's classic tiger behaviour. Nonsense, said her elder brother. It was clearly just a normal cat, because when I opened the back door, because it was staring at it for ages, it just sat there and didn't come in. I mean, what more proof do you need? I think it was a cheetah, said the middle sister, because when I spoke to it, it was quite dishonest. Speculation has raged on. Could it have been a hybrid? Could it have been a new, unique species? Or could it have been more than one type of cat at the same time? We will never know now, said the family's father. I'd love to have interviewed the cat, but the cat ran off after it stepped in the road and was nearly run over by a half-blind driver. He looked sort of familiar. I think he works for the Prime Minister or something. I'm Andy, that's all fake news, and you're watching Alverstoke Antiviral.
Well, good morning or afternoon, depending when you're listening to this. And it's really good to have Glenn Galbraith with us today. He's from Lee Park, which has been in the news recently for all the wrong reasons. But we're here to talk to him today about some good things that are going on. And some of you will have seen some item about this in our recent news sheet. Glenn, good to see you here. Would you like to just say a little bit about yourself for the people at Alverstoke so they know who you are in case they don't?
Absolutely. So I'm Glenn Galbraith. My wife Tammy and I moved to the UK 16 years ago. And we were in Scotland for about 8 years, and we've now been at Lee Park for the past 7 years. We started the church in Scotland and planted it, and essentially didn't do too much different here in Lee Park. It's almost like a replant. So yeah, been here about 7, working on our 8th year.
And you were talking earlier to me about what it was like when you first came to Lee Park. Would you like to tell people what that was like?
Yeah, so there were 5 members of the church. All of them were older, mature saints. And so the energy levels were not all that high. If family members would visit from out of town, sometimes they would hit sort of 9 or 10 on a Sunday morning, but that's really about as much as they had gotten. They hadn't had a pastor since 1997, so I think that would have been about 12 years before we got here, that they'd been without a pastor. So that was the situation we came into. Really, it was pretty dire. It was in a place where there just wasn't a whole lot happening. They were in survival mode, and so just trying to keep the doors open, but really didn't have the energy or the resources or the leadership or the vision even to expand the congregation. So yeah, that's when we arrived.
And was it worse than you thought it might be, or had they given you an accurate impression of the reality of things?
It's interesting because we had been somehow given an FIEC document from a group from probably 5 or 6 years before we got here. A group from FIEC had come down to do an evaluation of the church, and somehow that gotten into our hands. I don't know who gave it to us. And it was almost exactly what the church was. They really nailed it when they came down. But the people of the church weren't quite convinced it was as bad as the FIEC was making out. And so it was harder than we imagined. There were some situations that had to be dealt with very, very quickly. If we were ever going to move forward, the ethos of the church needed to change. It needed to be an outward-looking, more loving, more receptive community. Besides what had to be done to the facility, just the community feel needed to change. It needed to become a church of Lee Park in order to reach Lee Park.
Right, and we come to today, and as some folk will have seen, you're sort of in the first throes, as it were, of extending the building. Would you like to either tell us a bit about that, or walk around and show us a little bit of what's happening?
Absolutely. So I'm here in what used to be just a big green grassy meadow on would be the south side of the church, and so there's a big banner that we put up on the building when we first arrived, and this used to just be a big grassy area. Our car park is on the far side of it, next to the Working Man's Club. And so in between the car park and that building is where we are building the new building. And it's hard to see with just the steels, but if you can imagine that that's all going to be closed in all around there. And that will then double our floor space. So the building currently is 2 floors, and this new building is only 1 floor, but it is the same size as both of those floors put together. So it will be an auditorium. This section here, between that steel and that steel over there, this will all be one auditorium. Should seat between 125 and 150 people. And then the other side, the other half, sort of from, let's see, there all the way over to there, to the front. So the front half will be 4 new toilets, that will all be handicapped, just single toilets, and then a creche right here at the back, and then a big, large sort of reception area. That brown bit on the outside of the wall there was built or put into the wall in 1965 when this building was built, because originally they had every anticipation of putting an extension on that would be the auditorium. The church was actually built without an auditorium. And so this is where the auditorium was meant to go. If you've been to Eastney and you've seen their building, that's an exact copy of this building. And what is their auditorium was meant to go right here. And 1965, when this church building was built, 66, they moved into it. In 1968, Jim Kerr, who had been the pastor, left. And by 1970, the church had closed its doors. So they had never really got their feet under them after the first initial stage of the building. And that's where it stayed from 1970 until, well, 2 weeks ago when these steels went up.
Wow.
So.
And of course, it's one of the things with buildings is that when it's just a patch of ground, it always looks smaller than it will actually look when it's finished. You get what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm trying to step away so you can kind of get the whole thing and see the scope of it.
Yeah.
Compared to the old building. And
it's got pronounced dip in the middle.
Yep.
Was that a particular heavy builder who sat on the center
yeah.
steel?
It seems like it, doesn't it? Yeah. I'll tell you what it is. It's kind of a funny story. When we first met with the architect, and he said, well, what do we have in mind? And there was a brand new Starbucks had just opened up in Portsmouth. Very stylish, very Starbucky, very, sort of modern and everything. And so I said, well, where the new Starbucks is? That's what we want. So he actually went down there and ordered himself a coffee and sat in the Starbucks and then came back with these drawings. And so, yeah, all we have to do is stick a Starbucks sign on the outside and no one would know the difference.
Until they walked inside.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I realize our coffee is not nearly as good.
Maybe there's a future partnership you could have there, but that's another story.
Exactly. Yeah.
And how big is your congregation now? You're going to be able to seat 150 or more people in this. How many are you at the moment?
If everyone turns up, we're probably about 40 people, 40. Although we've gained about 3 or 4 new families just in the past, well, however long we've been on lockdown. I don't know if how exactly to take that, but we've had several new families that have joined us every Sunday morning, and we've had a lot of contact with them during the weeks. Even one man that prayed with me over Zoom to receive Christ as Savior, and a couple people that we've been able to get together with in other socially distant aspects, but actually doing discipleship with them. So we're hoping that our congregation will actually be bigger by the time we actually get to meet face to face.
Yeah, brilliant. And we hope so too. And
Yeah.
at the front, my understanding is you're going to have a connecting passageway that connects the old with the new, and also means you can come straight from the car park into the building effectively.
That's right. Yeah, I'm trying to make my way around to the front with all of the construction fencing. It's hard to see it very well, but if I bring you around to the front, where our current front door is, and if you can kind of look all the way down there, you can see just a little bit of the steels poking out. And all of this is going to come down, and there'll be a nice new port that connects the old building and the new building, running all the way to the car park. So when you get out of your car, you'll be able to walk undercover all the way to the front doors.
Brilliant. That's that must be really exciting. And what a change, really, since when you first got here, or since 1970, was it, when you said they basically shut the church?
That's right. Yeah, it has been a big change. I mean, just everywhere I look, there are physical changes, but much more than that, and much more importantly than that, has been the spiritual changes and the influence that the church is now having on Lee Park and on our community that just didn't exist before. Most people thought that this was an abandoned building. Even the neighbors that lived 2 or 3 houses down thought that it was an abandoned building. So that alone has made a huge difference.
And funding of all of this, I mean, it's a remarkable work of God that you're at this position where you're, building to accommodate much more. But obviously, there's a financial cost involved in this. How is that being covered?
Well, we've had some sizable donations from supporters in America, churches that support Tammy and I as a family. One particular church gave a very large donation for this to all get started, because up until then it was just a pipe dream, because we had no idea how we would possibly pay for it. So when they started the ball rolling, others got on board, and we're probably, with everything that's come in so far, I would imagine we're close to halfway as far as the funding. So we have enough money to get the concrete base poured in between the steels now, and then we're sort of out of money. Our goal, all of us at the church are 100% agreed. We want to do this without getting into debt at all. We just believe that would be such a good testimony to the Lord, and we're really not in a place, even though lots of good things are happening, we're not in a place where it would be prudent or safe for the church to take on debt. So we're doing all we can to do this without any debt. The next stage is going to be about another 50 or 60,000, and there is money that's been promised to that effect. We have to wait and see if it actually comes through, and then probably another 50,000 or so, maybe even more, to do the finish work. So that's where we are. If nothing happens, we'll have a lovely, great big car park.
You could always, and you could always put a big nylon covering over it, like a huge tent.
Just a big tarp over it, and we'll just have tent meetings every week.
No, we hope for much more than that.
Absolutely.
Glenn, that's really good to speak to you, and I hope the people at Alverstoke will be encouraged by what they've heard from very small beginnings to where you are today. And the Steels themselves look like a small thing, but actually in the history of this building, of this church and the community, it's a big step forward. Yeah. And I guess you're encouraged. You're usually a positive bloke, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. I always seem to see the positive side of things, and now that it's actually up and can envision it, I'm really, really encouraged. And again, we've been really, really trying to focus on the fact that this is still just a building. This is not the church. The church that God is building is happening in hearts and homes all over this community, and that's what we're mostly encouraged about.
That's good to hear. And one final question. Thanks very much for your time today. And you've cycled up here too.
I did, yeah.
We've heard the recent death of a teenage girl. There was something else on the news from your area. Mm-hmm. Are they situated quite close to where you are right now? Or have they affected the community much?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the girl was taken maybe a quarter of a mile that way. The police asked to see our CCTV when they were investigating because they thought that she might have been taken on this road. But so she was close. And then the other incident happened about a quarter of a mile the other way. So it has certainly hit our community hard. And it's what people are concerned about. We as a church have committed to pray and try and contact these families as much as we can to offer any condolences and prayer. But yeah, it's a terrible situation. But at the same time, God can do amazing things with horrible, horrible situations. And that's what we're praying for, that God would do something great despite this.
Yeah. Well, would you mind if I prayed? And we'll finish with that, because we need God's help and we need God's provision. And unless the Lord builds the house, all of our work is meaningless. So I'll pray for you. And thanks very much for your time. I mean, I'll say
thank you, Colin.
After I prayed. Father, thank you so much that what shut down in 1970 and what was a very small congregation when Glenn and Tammy came down to Lee Park, that things have changed so much by your involvement in the lives of people, by the good news of Jesus being proclaimed, by the devotion and time put in by Glenn and Tammy and others. We thank you so much for all of that has brought about this, the steels being put up and the hope of more space to accommodate people of Lee Park. We ask, Lord, particularly that the lockdown, that the horrible things that have happened very recently in this community that will have grieved and upset so many people will actually cause people to look for help and hope in yourself. And we ask, Lord, please, that you strengthen the church there at Lee Park to be open and wise and loving and compassionate in the opportunities that might arise, and that your church might grow out of these sad situations and out of the possibilities too that this new building will give. And please provide the money. You have all resources at your disposal. And we ask, Lord, that you would provide for Glenn and Tammy and for the church there at Lee Park. And that we even ask that this building will prove too small in the not too distant future. And we ask this, please, in your Son's name, who gave his life for us and for the people of Lee Park. Thank you, Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Glenn, that was really good. Thank you getting on your bike too. I just sat in my office. But it adds,
my pleasure.
It adds a lot to the interview, I hope, to actually see what's there.
Amen.
And to put a face.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin.
That's all right. Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Cheers. All right.
I'm going to shut off now.
Yep.
Oh, good to see you, Andy.
Good to see you, Colin. We are going to do a bit of a special today, aren't we? Because on Sunday, on the Sunday stream, we were talking about Jesus. And it was obvious from how much you were saying that there was more ground to cover in terms of who Jesus is. Obviously we've been doing books of the Bible, haven't we? And we did 1 Samuel last week, but we thought this week we could actually pause what we're doing in our track through the Bible and actually have a one-off and talk about Jesus. That's right, isn't it, Colin?
It is indeed, yeah. We thought it was worthwhile when we chatted about it, doing this for a little bit longer. I mean, there's an immense amount we could have a look at. I've got some fat books on my chair here about Jesus. But one of the things that's mysterious probably about the Incarnation is just, why did Jesus do this? And what was this for, him becoming a man? We'll certainly touch upon that in this session. And what has he done for us? I always think that with this Jesus, we sometimes have very quick answers to some of those questions, instead of exploring the wealth of different aspects, not only to why he did this, but what he's done for us. So we'll touch upon some of that this evening or today. Yeah. And just to pick up on what we said last week, we did say that Jesus, it's not as if he's like two types of people stuck together, God and man, and that he sometimes is acting as God and then other times he's acting as man. Jesus has two natures that are in union together, and that's important to remember. It's not as if one moment he's switching from one person to the next person, etc. And we also said that he's not a third type of person, a sort of a mixture of God and man to make this sort of third kind of person. He is one person, both God and man. Sometimes we call him the God-man. So that's who we're looking at today. One of the questions that I had was, Jesus really a man like us? I don't know what you think on that, Andy. Well, not like us personally, because that would be dreadful.
Thank heavens for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose it comes down to, who do we think Jesus is? And even if you've just started looking at Christianity, there's so much that he does which is so spectacular and so special, and yet at the same time there's something about him which is so down to earth, isn't there? And he relates to the ordinary people, and you're left wondering how do we make sense of who he is?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, the reason I put who is this man is because sometimes people are asking that. They're not asking who is this God. So the appearance of Jesus is very physical, very human. That's what's visible and up front in their interactions with him. But as you say, there is this remarkable compassion and power that is visibly demonstrated in amazing signs and teaching as well. Yeah. I'm going to go on to the next one. If he was a man like us, was his temptation really anything like ours? Because sometimes people imagine him with the sort of Superman shirt tucked underneath his cloak, which is usually white. I don't know why. And you sort of think, well, was his temptation anything like ours? Should we have a look at that later, or say anything about that now?
Maybe later.
Maybe later. One of the big questions that comes up sometimes when we get into this, especially when you're younger and still have a mind buzzing, was, could Jesus have sinned? That's a real knotty one, which we might tackle a little bit later on. We could go on for the rest of Antiviral with this. Now, if Jesus had sinned, what would that have meant for the God-man that he was? And it has huge implications, but we'll talk about that towards the end. And is Jesus still a man today? That's something we did look at last Sunday and said that yes, he is. He was and is God, and then he also became a man, or the Son of God became a man, and he remains a man, which is a comfort to us if we believe that. So we could go to what is said about Jesus to find out a few answers to those things. And I've gone down this route because the Bible does declare who Jesus was, and we can get into all sorts of philosophical discussions and debates about how these two natures demonstrate themselves or show themselves, these two natures, I should say, how they're revealed, why one is more visible than the other, if that's the case. But it says in Hebrews 4:15, we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. So we asked earlier, didn't we, was he tempted just like us? What do you think that passage is saying there, Andy, about that?
Well, it kind of depends what you mean by tempted, because I don't want to anticipate the discussion, but temptation, are we talking about external or internal? Because I think that's where maybe there might be a difference between Jesus and us. Because if temptation is me whispering in your ear and saying, go on, sin, Jesus was certainly confronted by that. The devil tempted him, and even Peter tempted him. But Peter said, "Oh, you're not going to die. You don't need to go to the cross, anything like that." And Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." So he definitely faced external temptation, and Hebrews makes a lot of that actually in how it actually qualifies him to represent us well, because he knows what it's like to come under pressure from voices around us and situations where he's being tempted to do the wrong thing.
Yeah, and we talk about internal because he had a body, because he got hungry, because he got tired, because there were work pressures and demands upon him at some points consistently. Most of us as human beings would try and relieve ourselves of those pressures one way or another. And so there was that bodily sort of being plain and human that caused him to be tempted or enticed. There was a lever, if you like, that Satan and others could use. But as you say, he had no internal bias towards doing wrong like we do. Yeah. Okay. And this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, it says, that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. So those verses, those words are making it abundantly clear that actually in Jesus we do have a human being, a man. I put man in quotes earlier just because that includes man, he as a man, as a head, as it were, encapsulates all it is to be human, both man and female. And so he had to be made like them. So that's certain things that the Bible are saying about him that we're meant to take on board. Even if we've got questions, we need to make sure that we come back to those and use them as our rock and our foundation when we might be swayed about who he is. Bible passage I thought we'd look at for a few minutes is Hebrews 10, verses 4 to 10. Some of these are in NIV, some are ESV, so it's not always correct that, but that was what I did. In Hebrews 10, it talks about the Incarnation, and I always find it enjoyable when I come across texts that speak about, as it were, Christmas, when they're not Christmas text in one sense. So this one, he summarizes, the writer, in verse 4, it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body have you prepared for me. And then down in verse 7, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. What do you reckon he's referring to in the scroll of the book there?
I'm not sure. So is he quoting from a psalm there?
Yeah, he is. Yeah, so it could be that. Quite likely is that. But it could be other psalms as well. Yeah. But you'll notice, well, it's worth noticing, folks, that his incarnation, which he's provided with a body, or one is prepared for him, he's going to do what the blood of bulls and goats can't do. But you notice his coming at Christmas and his arrival on the scene, I have come to do your will, is all about submission and obedience to his Father. So even the birth of Jesus, or the conception and birth of Jesus, was to fulfill what his Father purposed, and his life continues that. And that's why on the PowerPoint it says that the Incarnation is important as Easter, is because his coming in a body was in order that eventually not only would he live through life in submission and obedience, but he'd take that submission and obedience to the full length of actually giving himself for the sins of a rebellious world and people. So I actually prefer not to, I know that Easter is effective in making the final reconciliation between us and God. So in one sense, that's the pinnacle. But this passage of Hebrews is actually joining all of this together and emphasizing that submission. Submission and obedience, the life of Christ, is not something in in the past 10 years or so that people have written a lot about. So there's been a lot of discussion about atonement and the extent of that. But the imitation of the life of Jesus, of this submissive obedience to the Father, is neglected, and consequently we devalue the whole Incarnation in some respects.
Yeah, well, I mean, the question, who is Jesus, is in some ways is one of the most important questions anyone could ever consider. And it's the questions the Gospels confront us with. They show us this person, and they show us all these claims, and people go around saying, who is this Jesus? Who is this? The wind and waves obey him. And Jesus asks his disciples in the middle of the Gospels, doesn't he? He says, who do you say I am? And the reason that answer is so important is precisely because what you said is that the Incarnation, the Christmas, and the atonement at Easter are inseparable. And historical point on this, when the Nicene Creed was being written, it's very, very clear. It goes on explaining how Jesus is of one substance with the Father. And then it says, for us and for our salvation, he came down from heaven and was incarnate by the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary and was made man. So the whole point of the Incarnation was the gospel rescue, for us and for our salvation. And there are strains of thought that say, the gospel is just God became like us, or God came down to show us his character, or show us he loves us by living a good life. And they separate the fact that he actually came to die as a sacrifice, which is what Hebrews is getting at, isn't it? The body you prepare for me. And by his obedience, he became this perfect sacrifice. And therefore, who Jesus is essential to enabling what he does when he saves us.
Yeah, and we talked, didn't we, about his temptation, which in some respects is different to ours, especially as we give in to it. But he endured that for 30 plus years, and the antagonism of others, and just stuck true to his Father's will, which is remarkable, because we have trouble sticking true to the Father's will each week or each day, perhaps. Yeah. I like that quote, for us and for our salvation. I've just put up on the slide there Hebrews 10 and the quote, and the verses he's quoting from, which are from Psalm 40. And you will notice slight differences. It's often worth noticing when that happens and trying to understand why. It looks like the writer of Hebrews is using a Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament, and you'll notice the differences. But my ears you have opened, but a body have you prepared for me. We discussed that, Andy and I, a bit beforehand, and there may be implications that both of those are similar, although the Psalm one is a little bit more poetic to our hearing and is not really how we normally describe the making of a body, but we'll have to look into that a bit more. Yeah, I like the way that it makes it very clear: sacrifices and offerings, burnt offerings, sin offerings, all of those God didn't require. Here's the one that we require. So you may be listening in thinking, how can I be friends with God? What do I need to do? And he's saying everything that they used to do didn't cut the mustard? I don't know what the expression is.
Yeah, cut the mustard,
yeah.
cut the ice, or cut some parsnips. Or...
Yeah, it didn't work. And then it said, here I am. I've come. And we're to take note of that. this is the one who's come for us and become one of us. And we have a real friend and ally and human being and co-worker and compatriot who's been through it all and then suffered for us and in our place. Jesus is a man like us. These verses, I'll just skip through them. You can look them up in the early part of Luke. Just shows that he grew up, but he grew in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and men. So there's a couple of verses of that. And he was obedient to his parents. Young people, I could go on one there, if I'm not going to, because we all need to be obedient. And Jesus needed help. He had the Spirit descend on him in bodily form like a dove. We had a great discussion once about, was it descending like a dove, or was it actually descending like a bodily dove? Anyway, I'm not sure we got it right then, but it says there in bodily form, which is more explicit, I think, than the Bible we were using. And that the Spirit fills him, and he's led by the Spirit. He's tempted. You notice there he's hungry. And if you're familiar with those events, you'll know that Jesus was tempted to turn stones into bread. And I heard that Burger King was opened up and it had massive queue all day. At last they got the opportunity to have a Burger King and they went for it. Or Jesus had 40 days without food and he's tempted to, shortcut things to get the food and he doesn't take it.
And actually that's so important, not only because it shows he knows what it feels like, but it's because it's part of his passing the test that we all fail, isn't it? It's part of his righteousness, which is credited to us. And it's what fits him to be a perfect sacrifice, isn't it? Because he's a lamb without blemish. He can only be the sacrifice for our sins if he has none to pay for himself. And in passing that test, it's such a huge moment in the Bible. I'm struck by that verse you pulled up where it says, he grew in wisdom and filled with wisdom and the grace of God was on him. That sounds like Samuel in 1 Samuel. It sounds a bit like some of the judges, empowered by gifts from God, in some cases by God's Spirit, empowered and brought up as a rescuer. And yet, as we've been seeing in Antiviral time and time again, they just trough and they fail and they sin. And, look what happens to Saul. He totally fails. And yet, finally in the Gospels, in that episode, we get this moment where we have a rescuer who can beat Satan and they have nothing on him. And I'm struck, we live in a cancel culture where, we found some dirt on someone and they've done this, and, obvious examples are floating around at present, which we need not go on about. But just the thought that there could be someone who you could never dig up dirt on, who is completely immune from the worst things you could try and throw at him. And it's an amazing idea, but that's the idea of who Jesus is, and that's what qualifies him to save, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. And we're getting animated here, a bit like good these writers did, because he's good news. I've got the verse there. Angels came and attended him. We were looking up, did the angels come and strengthen him in Gethsemane? Did you find that verse?
I didn't check that now. So.
No, okay, but we might look that up. But you'll see here that the need of Jesus as a man for help from others, and how he eagerly desired to have the Last Supper with his disciples. Here's a man who's concerned for others and also benefits from the friendship and love of his friends, which means it was a harsh blow when one betrayed him and his friends left him. So we're just going to finish. Do interrupt me, Andy, if I'm going on. Who is this man? Was Jesus really a man like us? What would we answer to that?
Yes.
Yes. Good. And we have a man in heaven who understands it. Was his temptation really anything like ours?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Good. Could Jesus have sinned? No, there's a big one.
No, because he is two natures in one person, and he's also God as well as man, and therefore he can't deny himself. You can't have one who is divine sinning. So no, that would have created an impossible situation, I think.
Yeah. If Jesus had sinned, well, we've more or less covered that. What would that have meant for the God-man that he was? The implosion of the universe, really. God being untrue to himself. Well, who knows what that would have brought about, but it wasn't going to happen anyway, because God is faithful and true and righteous. And is Jesus still a man today? We've sort of answered that earlier on. And I think one of the things that struck me from a little bit of reading I did, that under our thinking, or Christian thinking about Jesus, has grown over the centuries, really, as people have explored, trying to understand and get to grips with what does it mean for Jesus to be man and God, which I find quite a fascinating thing. But as I think I've said already, this sort of notion of his humanity being up front and a bit like an eclipsing the fact that he's also God, seems to some degree to fit what we find in the Gospels, which is why they're saying, who is this man? Because they're just not seeing him as God. He's not sort of like some of the Marvel characters, sort of light blasting out of him and his body shattering. You know, he remains physically right the way throughout the events, a man.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is as well that today, you know, most people would agree that a man called Jesus existed once. And the hard part is then convincing people that no, that this is actually also God taken on flesh. 2nd century AD, early history of the church, it's completely the other way around. What the heresies are, the really early heresies, are called, it's called Docetism. It's the idea that he only seemed to be a man. There's no debate that he was divine, because, he's obviously doing miracles and stuff. And the 2nd century, they always have him too divine at the expense of his humanity, if you see what I mean. Yeah. And that, he just appeared to be human. He wasn't really. He was just, it was almost like a sort of hologram. And he was this super God who wasn't actually just like us. And the church had to push back quite hard at that. And assert the embarrassing humanity of Jesus, because people have low views of the flesh and humanity, and they wanted Jesus naturally in the culture. They naturally wanted him to be this super divine figure, and therefore the push is always to assert his humanity. And it's only later, around the time of the Nicene Creed, a few centuries later, in the 300s, that you really get the shrinking of Jesus when they say, there was a time where he didn't exist. Early on, that wasn't the issue. The issue was, well, he's obviously divine. The question is, is he really human or what?
And you could do a lot of reading there to try and delve into what they said. Some of it's really good in the Creed, Nicene Creed and other creeds. Different periods in history reveal the issues that they were tackling and needing to be standing firm on. And that we need to finish for this for today, but that brings us back to Colossians, where it mentions that he died in the body of flesh, and it mentions his body because that does seem to have been an issue there in that church, as it was, as you already mentioned, in the first couple of centuries of Christianity. And as I've sat here talking, I don't know how you found it, Andy, you have to tell me in just a minute. I just sort of think how great it must have been to, even in the storm of the boat or on the way out into the Sea of Galilee, just to be in the boat with this man, and then just to be gobsmacked and frightened out of your wits because he could just flatten the sea. And all sorts of things happened like that, didn't they? That were not only seen by the disciples, but by others. And so you and I, and you who are listening, we should really give this man a serious look. Give this God man a serious look and put our trust in him, because there isn't anyone else like him. Yeah, you wouldn't find Jesus, would you, up at the lectern saying, Judas, I think really he needed that money. You know, I think he was doing the right thing. You won't find Jesus backing up somebody like that, because he stuck true to what God wanted him to do. Yeah, great.
Yeah,
Andy, anything you want to add that's made you sort of think as we've talked today?
I'd second what you said about who Jesus is and how great he is. The application has got to be praise. If we had time to insert a song, we could insert a song, but that's a Sunday thing. So we can come back on Sunday where you can hear more, and we can have songs, and we can spend some time adoring Jesus for who he is. Yeah, I think. Do you have anything else to say?
We do have an interview with us today. Maybe Stephen can shove it on at the end here, which is about the church at Lee Park. And Glenn, I'm chatting with Glenn on the site of their extension. And he also mentions a little bit about how the couple of deaths of people in Lee Park within a quarter of a mile radius of where the church is has affected the community. But that's good to see that even now Jesus is building his people and growing his church and kingdom in these places. And it's all stemmed from who we've been talking about today. Thank you, Andy.
Well, stay close to Jesus and wash your hands.
Yeah.